Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, Detective Trogdor, and today we're going to be traveling west of the Youghiogheny River to a little place called the Darr Mine. Perfect. But before we go any further than that, I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsor for today. Hey Pops, what's up? Son, we need to talk. Well, what about, Dad? Your mother was cleaning your room and she found this. Dad, I swear I was just holding those for a friend. Son, it's okay. I understand. Your mother and I didn't have this talk with you yet about using proper beans. In this household, we only use the best of the best. That's why we choose to use Ubora coffee. Ubora Coffee is a veteran-owned and operated company based out of Augusta, Georgia. They ethically source their coffee and teas from countries all over the world, so there's a wide variety for all different types of coffee and tea drinkers. While other companies are raising their prices to match inflation, Ubora has remained consistent because they are dedicated to excellence and products for everyone to afford. Next time you make coffee at home, really think about making a switch over to Ubora Coffee. Not only does Ubora Coffee surpass anything you'll be able to find in a store, their coffee also will ship directly to your door anywhere in the continental U.S. You can contact them through email found on their website as well as through Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Thanks again to Ubora for supporting me and supporting my videos. And now, back to the episode. An excerpt from the United Mine Workers Journal on December 1st, 1957, titled, "The Main Thing Was Management Neglect." All of the mining disasters of December 1907 had several things in common. The main thing was management neglect and in some cases brutal criminal negligence. Black powder was used for blasting in all of these stricken mines. Coal dust was allowed to accumulate in spite of warnings from England that it was highly explosive. All of the mines were gassy and seemed to have been poorly ventilated. It is quite possible that the Jacobs Creek disaster, or Darr mine disaster, would not have taken place if the men had been allowed by Providence one more day to dig out at 40 feet of coal to reach a new shaft the company had sunk in an effort to improve ventilation in the mine. One of the victims of the explosion was a mine foreman, H.S. Campbell. His widow reported that his main preoccupation and worry in the months preceding the blast was gassy conditions and poor ventilation in the Darr mine. He pestered the company about it, and it was his urging that the new ventilating shaft had been sunk. Campbell's worry, which made him tell his wife he could not even think about Christmas, goaded the company into action, but it was 24 hours too late for 239 men. December 19th, 1907, at 11:30 a.m., the entire region around the Darr mine was shaking. Persons in the vicinity of the mine described the explosion as an awful rumbling force by a loud report and a concussion that shook the nearby buildings and was felt within the radius of several miles. The explosion had been so terrific in its force that the inspectors were convinced upon the superficial investigation that it would be impossible for any one of the entombed workers' marker to be rescued. Report of the Department of Mines of Pennsylvania, Part 2, Bituminous, 1907. The Darr mine was opened in 1899. At the time, it was the Pittsburgh Coal Company's most up-to-date mine. It had all of the newest modern technology. It had its own electric plant, and it also was right across the river from the Baltimore and Ohio, or B&O Railroad, so they could easily ship all their coal and anthracite out of the area. Most of the miners lived in a little town across the river called Jacobs Creek. The only way to get across the Youghiogheny River was to use a cable car that seated 6 people and was required for the 6 people to pull themselves across the river. Life was simple in this little mining town. It was comprised mainly of immigrants who wanted to make a mark in the new land. They wanted to make money for themselves, either to stay here or send it back home to help their family pay off any kind of debt. Most of the immigrants were of ethnicities known as Rusyns, which are Eastern Carpathian Mountains, Hungarians, Austrians, Germans, Poles, and Italians, with some mixtures of Greek and Russians. The Darr mine disaster was the 4th major mine disaster in the U.S. in December of 1907, which made December 1907 the deadliest mine fatality month in U.S. history. On December 1st of 1907, the Naomi mine explosion claimed 34 lives. On December 6th of 1907, the Monongah mine disaster in West Virginia claimed 362 people. And on December 16th of 1907, the Yolande mine explosion in Alabama claimed 57 lives. The Monongah mine disaster in West Virginia would be the most deadly mine disaster in U.S. history, followed after by the Darr mine disaster. December 19th was the same as any other day, with the exception that a large group of Russian and Greeks were celebrating the Feast of St. Nicholas. In observance of the Feast of St. Nicholas, many of the 400 or more Russian and Greek employees of the mine did not go to work that day, which is in large part why the numbers of the total deaths were not as high as they could have been. For this reason, this date not only is known as the Darr mine disaster, but is also known as the miracle of St. Nicholas. Some of the miners that were actually working at the Darr mine were people that had migrated over from the Naomi mine, which had only exploded 18 days prior. And the Naomi mine is... perfect. At 11:30 a.m., an explosion rocked the region. It could be felt for several miles around, and smoke and dust had coughed out of the mouth of the mine and settled right across the Youghiogheny. The people in the region instinctively knew after that rumble what had just happened, and instantly started rushing to the mouth of the mine to help as best they could. Miners from neighboring mines rushed over immediately without giving any supervision. 15 minutes after the explosion had occurred, the debris and rubble was already being cleared from the mouth of the cave and the first rescuers were going in. Though the rescue party had very little optimism that there were any survivors, they still had hope that some people had managed to get out of the area of the initial explosion and found some place to hide in safety. About 1,500 feet from the mouth of the mine, a heavy fall of roof was encountered by the rescuers. It was believed at this point that most of the survivors, if any, would be found about a mile and a half further beyond this fall of roof. The first crew that entered the mine had to be relieved only 2 hours after going in. After the first day, only 6 bodies had been recovered, 4 of which were identified, and 2 of which had their heads blown clean off. After the first day, they had only traveled 5,000 feet into the mine. 2 days after the explosion, on December 21st, 12 bodies had been recovered from the main shaft of the mine. At this point, though, no one had made any attempts to go into the side passages, air ducts, whatnot, to pull any bodies or look for survivors. On December 27th, so now 8 days after the explosion, the entire working section of the mine had been explored, and 220 bodies had been recovered. At this point, it was determined by the rescue party that all bodies not buried by rubble or roof falls had been recovered. This was the first time in U.S. mine rescue history that SCBAs were being used. SCBA stands for Self-Contained Breathing Apparatus, not to be confused with SCUBA. In my research, I've got conflicting reports on the number of survivors, but the general consensus is that this one person definitely survived. Tom Williams was a minecart rider, so he went from the bottom of the cave and would ride in the cart all the way to the top with the coal to make sure that it didn't get derailed, whatnot. Tom Williams was in a minecart near the entrance of the mine just a few minutes before the blast happened. Though he was initially knocked out, he was still otherwise fine. The other person that it has been, in my research, I found that he was a survivor was Joseph Mapleton, who worked for pumping the water out of the lower parts of the mine. He was on his way to go get oil for his pumps, his machinery, generator, whatnot, when he felt the earth rumble, and right before he could escape, he was blinded and disoriented by dust and smoke that was being blasted at him. After having been treated for his injuries, he immediately joined the rescue party. The initial reports given out to the newspapers were that 400 men had been entombed in the cave after the explosion. After reviewing the total number of people that had gone to work that day, it was determined that 230 miners had died that day in the Darr mine. This was the single most deadly mine disaster in Pennsylvania and the second most in U.S. history. This would leave 130 women widowed, 300 children without fathers, and 542 people without a source of income. Those who weren't initially killed by the explosion unfortunately only survived to succumb to the poisonous gases known as afterdamp, which is a mixture of irrespirable gases of carbon monoxide and nitrogen left over from any kind of cave fire or explosion. 239 employees were accounted for as deceased. However, it is speculated that that number actually could be higher on account of back in the early 20th century, miners would bring their sons down into the mines with them to help them out, because the miner was the sole source of income for most of these families. So these people are working 12 to 18-hour work days, and the best way to make sure that they can keep everything going is have, let's say, your son be there to bring you water, to help you move coal into the cart, because everyone had a prescribed amount of coal they were required to get out to be paid for that day. So what caused the explosion? There are many different theories about what happened this day and what caused this explosion to happen. But one thing is for certain, that an explosion occurred and people died. The main theory right now is that the miners were working in areas that were off limits to them because the fire boss had gone down previously and determined that those areas were not safe to work in because they had explosive gases, and other areas could just possibly have toxic gases which would just incapacitate the workers, not necessarily be flammable. Since these workers were using open flame mining helmets because batteries were not an easily accessible thing yet, and so flashlights were not an easy accessible thing, they would have little flames essentially attached to their hard hats. So if you bring a flame towards a toxic or explosive gas, you're going to get an explosion. Fireboss David Wingrove resigned after the explosion. It is said that he had notified officials that the mine was unsafe to work in prior to the explosion. The lack of proper ventilation, as well as the mine gases and coal dust, only compounded the explosion itself. An alternate theory suggests that this was not caused technically by the miners themselves, but alternatively it was some dynamite that had gone off on its own accord. So what became of this? What lessons were learned? What happened to the people afterwards? Many of the families of the miners had to end up packing up their stuff, and they had to go find employment somewhere else. They had to either go marry someone that could support them and their family, or a lot of them just decided to up and go back to their homelands. Within 6 months, the U.S. Geological Survey created the Mine Accidents Division. Mine fatalities began to drop the next year, and never again did so many mine workers lose their lives in a single accident. In consequence, these 239 men, many of them, like I said, were immigrants and did not have much money, were unfortunately buried in mass graves. Because of the nature of this job, a lot of the employees were poor. A lot of their money would be sunk immediately into the stores that were owned by the coal company, so no one could really truly get a leg up on life there, and because of that, no one had savings. The Pittsburgh Coal Company did the humane thing at this point and paid for a funeral for all of the people that had died in the mine disaster. Unfortunately, there was no single place that could handle 239 bodies at one time. Those that could afford to bury their family members somewhere did such that. Unfortunately, though, for 71 miners, 48 of them were unknown, were all buried in a mass grave in Olive Branch Cemetery. A memorial plaque was dedicated on September 14, 1994, located by the Olive Branch Cemetery in Pennsylvania. The Pittsburgh Coal Company, unfortunately, was not held responsible for the deaths of the people in the mine. But, fortunately, they did learn from this, and they abandoned the use of open lamps after this disaster. The Knox Mine disaster is a little footnote in history. A lot of people don't know that this happened because of the fact that this was mainly affecting immigrant workers. So a lot of people didn't have this story to pass on to them, though it is a big part of mine culture and mine history. These men went to work that day with the intention of shoveling coal, doing backbreaking work, and then coming home for 50 cents that day to provide for their family and looking forward to Christmas. Unfortunately, for 239 men, so 239-ish families, that was not the case. A lot of the women were kept from going to the mine because everyone knew that as soon as that body was pulled out, people would go into hysterics, and it was not something that needed to be handled at that moment. The Darr mine disaster, though tragic, is a story that has been lost to time. A lot of people do not know about it, but it is not gone without any kind of impact. Because of the Darr mine disaster being the fourth mine disaster in the U.S. in December of 1907, this finally was the last thing that needed to kick the federal government into creating the Bureau of Mines. In 1910, the U.S. Bureau of Mines was established to improve the health and safety conditions of those working in the mines. It's a he said, she said, pointing the fingers of, was it the miners going in areas that they shouldn't have whatever, cordoned off by the fire boss, or it could have just been gross negligence by the Pittsburgh Coal Company themselves. The Darr mine today exists just as a small hole in the ground that if you were walking along the banks of the Youghiogheny River, you would never even known it was there. People in the area are slowly forgetting its story, but it is up to us as a society to keep these stories going and remember the people that lost their lives needlessly on those days. My intention with this channel is to not only tell stories and give you facts about things that are interesting, fun, and whatnot, but is also to keep alive the history of people that may have been forgotten or may have been, fall victims to the system. But on that note, I'm going to wrap this video up at this point. I hope that you found this interesting. I hope that this inspires you to maybe look into the history, or next time you're in Western Pennsylvania, go take a walk along the Youghiogheny River and try to find the Darr mine and pay your respects. With that, I'd like to thank Ubora again for sponsoring me with coffee, and I'd like to ask you all to please check them out. I now have an Instagram. I'll throw it up here. It'll also be in the description. I'm working on a Facebook page. Who knows when I'll get to that, because I'm recording this video right now at 11:42 at night when I still have work tomorrow, and then we have to drive to South Carolina. But I really hope that you guys found this one interesting, and please, please, please give me a like, give me a subscribe, leave a comment, do what you can to help promote this channel, share it with friends, and just keep talking about it and help me out where you can. If you have any suggestions for topics, throw them in the comments below, or if you know who I am, just send me a message directly and we'll see what we can get done. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your support so far. I'm hoping that we can keep this going. Right now we're at 17 subscribers. You haven't been able to replace the 10 subscribers with 20, but we're getting there. And yeah, so we'll see you next time. Thank you once again. I'm Detective Trogdor, and this has been The Deep Dive.